The alkali dust was a shroud, clinging to the sweat on Alara's skin, filling her lungs with the taste of grit and defeat. It settled in the folds of her torn dress, a constant, gritty reminder of where she was. At the edge of nowhere, a town whose name was already a ghost on the wind. She was huddled behind the town's failing smithy, the scent of cold iron and horse manure thick in the air. Pain, a white and blinding sun, radiated from both her arms. They were splinted with rough-sawn planks and strips of her own petticoat, a clumsy, agonizing binding that did little to soothe the shattered bones within. Each shuddering breath was a fresh torment, a wave of nausea cresting with the throb. Tears tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, silent and unending. She had screamed herself hoarse hours ago, when their laughter was the only answer to her pleas. Now there was only this, a broken shape in the shadows, waiting for the sun to set or for her life to gutter out, whichever came first. He appeared not with a sound, but as a change in the light. A tall, broad shape blotting out the harsh afternoon glare. Alara flinched, a ragged gasp tearing from her throat, as she tried to press herself further into the rough wood wall behind her. Her body screamed in protest. Another one. Come to finish the job. Come to laugh. The man stopped. He stood beside a rangy sorrel, the reins held loosely in one large, calloused hand. The sun baked the cracked leather of his duster and glinted off the dust motes dancing around his hat. She couldn't see his face, only the hard line of his jaw and the deep shadows beneath the brim. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her, his stillness more unnerving than any threat. Minutes stretched into an eternity, measured only by the frantic pulse in her ears and the searing rhythm of her pain. She squeezed her eyes shut, a litany of terror her only prayer. When she opened them again, he was closer. He had moved with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. He knelt, not so near as to touch her, but close enough that she could smell the scent of sage and distance on his clothes. He held out a canteen. The metal was dark, dented, cool. She stared at it, then at him, her gaze flicking between the offered water and the impassive shadow of his face. She didn't move. Every stranger was a threat, every kindness a trick. He seemed to understand. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unscrewed the cap and set the canteen on the ground between them, just within her reach if she could have reached at all. Then he retreated, standing back by his horse, resuming his silent vigil. The gesture was so simple, so devoid of expectation. It chipped away a tiny piece of her fear. Thirst was a claw in her throat. Slowly, painfully, she shuffled forward, her entire body a symphony of agony. She bent her head, clumsy as a newborn foal, and drank from the mouth of the canteen where it rested in the dust. The water was lukewarm, tasting of metal and life. It was the first kindness she had known in a lifetime. He watched her drink her fill, then he moved again. "I have a place," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He stepped forward, and this time she did not flinch away. She had no strength left for it. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her back, the other under her knees, lifting her with an unnerving gentleness. A cry was strangled in her throat as her broken arms were jostled, the world dissolving into a gray haze of pain. She was a doll of rags and broken sticks in his grasp, utterly powerless. He placed her sideways on his saddle, his own body a firm wall behind her as he mounted. The horse shifted, and the journey began, carrying her away from the town, away from the laughter, and into the vast, silent emptiness of the plains. She didn't know if she was being rescued or merely stolen. In the end, it made no difference. She was simply adrift, and he was the current that had caught her. The cabin was made of the same unforgiving land it stood upon, rough-hewn pine, chinked with mud and stone, a plume of smoke a fragile prayer against the immense, indifferent sky. Inside it was sparse but clean. A stone hearth, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against the far wall. It was a place of solitude, not loneliness, and the silence within its walls was a balm after the town's raw cruelty. He laid her on the cot as if she were made of spun glass, the coarse wool blanket a surprising comfort against her cheek. For days, the world was a fever dream of pain and shadows. He moved through it with a quiet economy of motion, a silent caretaker. He reset her arms, his hands surprisingly deft. She screamed then, a raw, animal sound that echoed off the bare wood walls, and he held her steady, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his work. He did not offer empty comforts. He offered competence. He fed her broth, spooning it carefully past her lips. He held a cup of cool water for her when the fever took her. He cleaned the wounds she couldn't see, his touch clinical yet careful. He never asked her name, and he never asked what had happened. He seemed to carry the knowledge of the world's casual brutality in his own bones, recognizing its mark upon her without needing the story. Alara watched him from the cot, her eyes tracking his every move. In the long silences, fear was her constant companion. She catalogued him for threats. The set of his shoulders, the weight of the pistol at his hip, the way he cleaned his rifle by the firelight. But his violence, she slowly began to understand, was a tool kept for the wild, not for the wounded. His gentleness was in his actions. The way he banked the fire so it would warm her through the night. The way he mended a strap on her boot, which had been torn, with neat, precise stitches. He spoke more to his horse than to her, soft murmurs as he curried the animal's coat in the evenings. His name, she learned, was Silas. He'd said it once, in response to a whispered, feverish question she barely remembered asking. Weeks bled together. The sharp, unceasing agony in her arms slowly subsided into a deep, monolithic ache. She started to see him not as a savior or a captor, but as a man. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders after a long day tracking whatever he hunted for their meals. She saw the faint lines of some old sorrow etched around his eyes. He was a fortress, and she was living within his walls, slowly learning the shape of the stones. One night, the pain crested in a way it hadn't for a week. A storm raged outside, the wind howling a mournful chorus around the cabin's eaves. The fire cast long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. She began to weep, not loudly, but with the deep, shuddering sobs of a soul that had held too much for too long. He came to her side, a dark shape in the flickering light. He didn't speak, just knelt by the cot. "They broke my arms," she whispered into the woolen blanket, the words tasting like poison. The confession, once spoken, could not be stopped. For fun, she finally looked at him, expecting to see pity, the one emotion she could not bear. But it wasn't there. His face, illuminated by the fire, was a mask of cold, still fury. A muscle jumped in his jaw. His eyes, dark and deep, held not pity for her, but a terrible, quiet promise for them. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her damp forehead. It was the first time he had touched her without necessity. The gesture was a tectonic shift. In the heart of the storm, within the fortress of his cabin, a fragile seed of trust, watered by a single silent tear, finally broke ground. The first time she moved her fingers, it was a miracle, a tiny, twitching rebellion against the tyranny of her injuries. Silas was across the room, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel the only sound. He stopped, his head cocked, as if he'd heard a change in the silence. Alara stared at her hand, wrapped in clean linen, and willed it to happen again. A flicker, then another. A smile, the first true smile in months, touched her lips, felt like a foreign country. From there, progress was a slow, arduous climb. She graduated from sipping broth to holding the bowl herself, her hands trembling, the muscles in her forearms screaming with the effort. Silas would watch, his expression unreadable, but he wouldn't help unless she was about to spill. He understood, without words, that this was a battle she needed to fight on her own. Her returning strength changed the rhythm of their days. She was no longer just a patient. She began to help, her movements clumsy at first. She stirred the stew, her grip on the wooden spoon awkward but determined. She folded the blankets, the simple domestic act a profound declaration of her own recovery. She was mending body and spirit in the quiet shelter he provided. One afternoon, while he was outside splitting wood, she found a tear in the shoulder of his canvas shirt. On the small shelf above the cot, beside a tin of antiseptic and a spare whetstone, was a small sewing kit. Her fingers were stiff, the needle felt alien, but she worked at it, her stitches uneven and thick. When he came back inside, he saw the shirt folded on the table. He picked it up, running a thumb over the clumsy repair. He looked over at her, where she sat by the fire, pretending to be absorbed in the flames. A long moment passed. "Thank you," he said. The two words were laden with a weight far beyond their meaning. She simply nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The connection between them was no longer just about survival. It was about the small, shared acts of living. He began to leave things for her on the table. A curiously shaped stone, a hawk's feather, and one day, a single, resilient purple wildflower he'd found clinging to life in a rocky crevice. Each was a silent message. "I see you. You are here." The world had returned. She no longer felt like a ghost. But the world outside the cabin had not forgotten its cruelty. The sound came on the wind first. Hoofbeats, too many for one rider. Then voices. Loud, coarse, stained with a familiar brand of casual malice. Alara froze, a half-peeled potato falling from her hand. Silas was instantly alert, his body going rigid, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. 3 riders. Their laughter was a raw, ugly sound that scraped at Alara's newly healed scars. She knew that laughter. It was the soundtrack to her nightmares. "Stay inside," Silas commanded, his voice a low growl. "Don't make a sound." He pulled his gun from its holster, checked the cylinder, and moved toward the door. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was about to be shattered. The men were coming for sport, and they had found it. Fear, cold and absolute, coiled in her stomach. It was the same fear from the alleyway, the same helpless terror. But this time something else was there alongside it. A flicker of rage. A refusal. This place was hers, too. She had healed here. She would not let them take it. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Silas stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the cabin and the riders. He stood with a calm that was more menacing than any overt threat, the pistol held loosely at his side. The 3 men reined in their horses, their grins widening as they took in the scene. The leader, a man with a bloated face and cruel, small eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well, look what we have here," he drawled, his gaze sweeping over the cabin. "Heard a man was holed up out this way. Didn't know he had company." His eyes flicked to the doorway, and for a second, Alara thought he could see her through the wood. She watched through a narrow gap, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas didn't answer. His silence was a wall. "We're looking for a girl," another man sneered, his gaze predatory. "Ran off from town a few months back. Real pretty thing, before she got clumsy." They all laughed, the sound of physical blow. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. They knew. "There's no girl here," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "You've got no business." "Ride on." The leader dismounted, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. "I think we'll be the judge of that." He took a step forward. "Now you can make this easy." Silas raised the pistol. "That's far enough." The confrontation escalated in a heartbeat. The other 2 men dismounted, spreading out to flank him. It was a fight he couldn't win. Not against 3. The first man lunged, and the world exploded into motion. A gunshot cracked the air, not from Silas, but from one of the others trying to startle him. Silas moved with brutal efficiency, his pistol whipping around to strike one man in the temple, sending him staggering back. But the leader was on him, a heavy fist catching him in the jaw. As they wrestled in the dust, the 3rd man circled, drawing a long knife from his belt. Paralyzing terror seized Alara. She saw the alley, She felt the phantom pain in her arms. She was the broken thing again, helpless. But then she saw Silas, fighting for her, for the sanctuary they had built. A fire, hot and cleansing, burned away the fear. She was not that woman anymore. Her gaze fell upon the hearth. The heavy cast-iron skillet sat beside it, black and solid. Her arms were not strong, but they were hers. She snatched the skillet, its weight a shock, and burst through the door. The man with the knife was creeping up behind Silas, his blade raised to strike. Alara didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy pan with all the force her mended body could muster. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. The suddenness of her attack startled the leader, giving Silas the opening he needed. He drove his elbow into the man's throat. Then a final, decisive blow sent him sprawling. The fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the low groan of the man on the ground. The third had already scrambled onto his horse and fled. Silas slowly rose, wiping blood from his lip with the back of his hand. He looked at the man Alara had struck, then at her. She stood there, still holding the skillet, her arms trembling from the exertion. He walked over to her, his eyes searching hers. There was no shock, no surprise. There was only a deep, quiet understanding. Profound respect. He gently took the skillet from her hands and set it down. Then, his touch infinitely careful, he examined her arms, his fingers tracing the faint scars beneath her sleeves. "You shouldn't have," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. He had not rescued a victim. He had armed a survivor. Later, by the fire, the familiar silence returned, but it was transformed. It was no longer a space between two solitary people, but a shared peace, forged in violence and sealed in trust. Alara looked down at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer just reminders of her pain. They were instruments of her will. The world outside the cabin was still vast and unforgiving, but it was no longer an enemy. It was just a place. And in it, they had carved out a home, a small point of light against the gathering dark, built not of wood and stone, but of resilience and a silent, unshakable bond.